The purpose of this video is to explore the properties and applications of absolute value in number sense. By the time a student gets to high school or middle school, they've usually been exposed to the absolute value symbols at some point, but a lot of times there are some misconceptions, so let's take a look at the definition to formally understand what this term means. The absolute value of a given quantity is its distance from zero on the number line. Since distance is something that is always positive, the result of an absolute value is also always positive. As you can see below the number line here, we'll use these symbols in red, see these straight brackets, to indicate that we are taking the absolute value of a quantity. You'll also notice from the number line given here that there is often two values that contain the same absolute value, a positive and a negative distance from zero. So we could say that the absolute value of 2 is 2 because it's 2 units from 0, but we can also say the absolute value of negative 2 is 2 because it's 2 units from 0 as well. Before we take a look at a couple examples, there are some common misconceptions that students have every year if they really haven't paid attention to this definition of absolute value. The first thing is they seem to indicate that they think absolute value just tells you to get rid of negative signs in the problem. Other students think that they're supposed to take the opposite of the sign inside the brackets. That's not always true. You would just want to simplify the expression as much as possible and then take the distance from 0. Some other students don't recognize that the absolute value symbols are in the problem and they just treat them as regular parentheses and not realize their mistake until they hand a paper in. Always tell the difference between regular parentheses and these straight absolute value brackets. The last thing that's more of a new thing that you'll get to when you get to more complicated expressions in algebra is the distributive property we learned earlier in this topic. If you need to, you can go back and take a look at the video for that. Does not work for absolute value brackets. You cannot distribute a number from the outside into the bracket because of the new meaning and operations that go along with this absolute value bracket symbol. Next, we'll take a look at a few examples of absolute value and see how this works. So we look at example A, the absolute value of negative 124. We look at that as 124 units away from 0. So that is a positive distance, and we just make this 124. Now you look at the second example, minus the absolute value of 200. We notice that the minus is on the outside of the absolute value bracket. So we take the absolute value of 200 first, which is 200 distance from 0, and then apply the negative afterwards. So be careful there to see whether the sign is on the inside or the outside. Example 3 has us perform an order of operations before we apply the absolute value. So we have the number negative 7 added to 6, and we simplify that to be negative 1 first before we apply the symbol. So always simplify as much as possible inside before we take that absolute value. The distance of negative 1 from 0 is 1 unit. So that's our final answer for that example. And we look at the difference between example C and example D. Example D takes the absolute value of each number individually and then adds them together. So we add 7 and 6 after we take the absolute value of each, and we get 13 in this case. There are many examples of how statistics and computer science and chemistry and other fields of science deal with absolute value when they need positive outcomes, but in mathematics class usually it's dealing with distance. So an example like this, we say, suppose that an elevator in a large hotel is traveling from the 10th floor above the street level to the 3rd floor parking garage below street level. How many floors do we actually travel on this elevator? So you think about it, we have a distance from the 10th floor down to the ground level. That is a positive distance from ground level up of positive 10. And then we go below ground level, and we can think of that as a negative 3, or traveling down 3 floors below the ground. If we add those together, we should take the absolute value of each in order to find our total distance traveled. So the total distance traveled from 10th to the ground floor is 10, and our distance in the negative direction is 3. We take the absolute value of each. 10 plus 3 equals 13. So I actually traveled 13 floors. Now, if we think about this practically, we often can figure out what we're doing, but if we get confused with the positives and negatives, we can make some easy mistakes not applying the absolute value appropriately. So that's it. When you get to some more complicated courses, you'll see that sometimes they'll use absolute value in cases where they really need to get a positive outcome. So they'll implement that into some of the equations and the expressions that they write. Until then, this should be good enough to help you simplify some expressions in number sense and in pre-algebra. Thank you so much for watching. Please check out my channel for many more videos on mathematics and other topics.